We hear it all the time, right? India's economy is booming, one of the fastest growing in the world. But if you look behind those big headlines, there's a really troubling story unfolding in the countryside. There's a crisis gripping the very sector that supports most of the population. So today, we're going to unpack this paradox.
So that's the big question, isn't it? How can a country have this incredible economic growth while its agricultural heartland is, well, stuck in a state of crisis? It's a puzzle that really forces us to look deeper than just the surface, into the nitty-gritty of economic policy, both from today and from the past. And to get to the bottom of it, we actually have to go back in time.
Okay, so to really understand what's happening today, we need to rewind the clock. Because the pressures that Indian farmers are facing right now, they're not totally new. In fact, they had this powerful historical echo that goes all the way back to the colonial period.
So back then, the key concept was something early Indian thinkers called the drain of wealth. Now, this was not just regular trade. It was a system where the colonial state basically took a huge economic surplus, a ton of goods out of India for free. And this drain created this devastating one-two punch. It crushed the supply of goods for people living there, and it absolutely destroyed their ability to buy whatever was left.
And the impact? It was just staggering. In the last 50 years of colonial rule, the amount of food grain available for each person in British India dropped by 25%. Just let that sink in for a second. A quarter of the food supply per person just gone. And let's be clear, this wasn't some natural disaster. It was a direct result of policy.
So how did this whole machine even work? Let's break it down. First, the colonial state hits the population with heavy taxes. Second, it uses that tax money to buy up valuable crops for export. Third, and this is crucial, those crops were sent to Britain for free. India didn't get any foreign money back to buy imports, which brings us to the final step, the devastating result. This whole system crushed both supply and demand. There was less food to go around and people had less money to buy it. It was a perfect self-sustaining squeeze.
Okay, so that was a pretty bleak picture. But the story doesn't end there. After independence in 1947, India went down a completely different path. This era was a huge break from that colonial stagnation, a very deliberate interruption that was all about state support for agriculture.
And this timeline, well, it lays it all out pretty clearly for us. You've got three distinct chapters. First, the colonial era, stagnation under so-called laissez-faire or hands-off policies. Then you have the dirigiste era from the 50s to the 80s, where the state actively intervened and you saw real growth. And then the neoliberal era, from the 90s until today, which, as we're about to see, is a worrying return to stagnation.
So what is this dirigism thing anyway? Well, it's basically the exact opposite of a hands-off approach. The state took a really strong, directive role in the economy. And for Indian agriculture, this meant policies that were specifically designed to protect and promote small farmers. We're talking price supports to make sure they got a fair income, loans from state-owned banks, and trade barriers to protect them from the crazy swings of the global market.
And did it work? You bet it did. The numbers really speak for themselves here. Take a look at this chart. Food grain availability per person, which had hit a low of about 150 kilos a year at independence, climbed all the way up to 180 kilos by the late 80s. This was a massive reversal of that colonial decline. The state's intervention actually worked. It broke the cycle. All right, so that brings us to our third chapter. Starting in the 1990s, India, just like a lot of the world, shifted gears toward what we call neoliberal policies. And what's so fascinating, and frankly, so concerning, is how this new era created a squeeze on agriculture that sounds an awful lot like an echo of the colonial past, just with a different mechanism.
Now, this is really important. The squeeze we're seeing today isn't that old colonial drain of physical stuff. Instead, it works by attacking people's ability to buy things, their purchasing power. The source material for this explainer calls it income deflation. It's a bit more subtle, but believe me, it's just as powerful. And when you put these two eras side by side, wow, it's really striking. On the left, you've got the colonial drain, pulling out surplus with direct taxes and forced exports. On the right, you've got neoliberal income deflation, doing it by cutting public spending, pushing out small producers, and letting corporations take over. But just look at the bottom line. The result, in both cases, is exactly the same. Stagnant agriculture and crushed domestic demand. Different playbook, same outcome.
So let's dig into the four big drivers of this income deflation. First, governments cut public spending, especially in rural areas, all in the name of sound finance. Second, you see a new kind of deindustrialization, where big corporations push millions of self-employed, small-time producers out of business.
Third, corporate giants take control of marketing, squeezing the profits of the farmers who actually grow the food. And finally, you get this worsening income inequality, where wages flatline while profits for the big guys just keep going up.
And, this isn't just some abstract theory. Take a look at this number. The share of wages in India's organized manufacturing sector has dropped to less than 15%. That's a real, concrete number that shows you exactly what that fourth driver looks like. Wealth is getting concentrated at the very top, and it's being pulled away from the very workers whose spending is supposed to power the economy. The end result of all this income deflation is just chilling. Basically, all the progress that was made during that Dirigiste era was wiped out. Per capita food grain availability in India fell right back to the levels you saw during the absolute worst years of colonial rule, right around the start of World War II. I mean, what a stunning reversal.
Okay, so faced with this crisis, a common argument you hear is, well, if small-scale peasant farming isn't working, let's just get rid of it. Let's bring in big, efficient corporate agriculture. And, on the surface, it kind of sounds logical, but we really need to dig in and see if it would actually solve the real problem.
So yeah, that's the multi-billion-dollar question, right? Could this corporate approach actually fix the stagnation and tackle the huge problem of rural poverty?
The analysis in our source material is pretty blunt. A clear no. Even if we assume that corporate farms would be way more productive, you have to ask yourself, what happens to the hundreds of millions of people who currently work on those small farms? In an age of so-called jobless growth, the modern economy just can't absorb that many people. Kicking them off their land without giving them other jobs would be a recipe for mass pauperization. It would actually increase absolute poverty, not fix it.
So, if the colonial model failed, and the neoliberal echo is failing, and the big corporate solution looks like a potential disaster, where do we go from here? Well, the source material offers a very clear and maybe even challenging alternative.
Well, the core argument here is that real, genuine development, the kind that helps everyone, requires a total change in strategy. It means making a clean break from neoliberal policies and going back to actively protecting and promoting peasant agriculture. A lot like what happened in that Dirigiste era. The idea is that the goal shouldn't just be growth for growth's sake, but equitable development that actually lifts everybody up.
And this brings us to a final, really powerful thought from the author Prabhat Patnaik. He argues that this alternative path just isn't possible within the current global system. It requires what he calls a degree of delinking from the kind of globalization we have now, the kind that's dictated by international finance. It's a provocative idea for sure, and it leaves us with a really critical question. What does it take for a country to follow a path of authentic development, one that puts its own people ahead of the demands of global markets? A question that, for now, remains at the very heart of India's growth paradox.